my name is Seana Jewer. I work with Nova Scotia Health on a program or initiative, Roots of Hope, which is a community suicide prevention initiative. It's housed with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, so there's Roots of Hope sites across Canada, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about Roots of Hope, but I'm going to be kind of expanding that conversation out a little bit farther to talk about what we can do perspective around suicide prevention. Roots of Hope is currently being piloted in the northern zone, and with our hopes that we'll be able to outroll this across the province. And so I'm here to start planting some seeds around ideas of how we can see suicide prevention in a much wider lens than what we might traditionally been. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right, I'm going to go into present mode here. Okay, perfect. So you should see my screen now. So here we are, community suicide prevention. What can we do in our communities here? And so I'm going to start off with just a land acknowledgement to acknowledge that we are situated in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and Wallis people first signed with the British Crown in 1726. These treaties did not involve the surrendering of rights to the land and resources that they have traditionally used and occupied. We are all treaty people. And I'd like to further acknowledge that we are in Nova Scotia, which is the birthplace of Black culture and heritage in Canada. People of African descent have shared these lands for over 400 years and are over 50 strong and resourceful African Nova Scotian communities exist here today. And so important to acknowledge these different communities as we talk about suicide prevention, as each community experiences suicide in different ways, and what contributes to suicidal thoughts is very complex and very diverse, and we want to be able to acknowledge that that as well. So to kind of lay the landscape and where my mind is at with suicide prevention, and to hold no bars of where I'm coming from, I offer this quote from Desmond Tutu, which says, "There comes a point where we need to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find why they are falling in." So throughout this presentation, I will be making note of how it is we can look at suicide prevention from much more than just from a risk-averse place where we're finding people in crisis and intervening at that moment, and understand that our role in community is much wider than that, and we have to encompass all these different social determinants of health, which many of you will be familiar with. But the story of how someone comes to be suicidal, how they find themselves contemplating, and how we lose people to suicide is a long story that doesn't start at the point of crisis. It starts much earlier than that. So we have to have a much better understanding of how these different social determinants help, how people's finances and employment statuses, their education coming in, their childhood experiences, the physical environments and the sense of social belonging that they have. All of these things contribute to people's suicidal thoughts in different ways. And so there is no one path, and it's complex. And we need to start to have a better understand that. But when we do this then community's role in suicide prevention becomes much, much wider. So I wanted to first just lay the groundwork around where the province is at with suicide prevention and risk reduction work. And I think, Aaron, you're going to throw in the chat there a link to the framework document. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but there's 6 action areas around suicide prevention and risk reduction. And I want to highlight that as a province, we are recognizing that community plays an important role in suicide prevention, and that is critical as far as steps moving forward. So now is a time, there's been many, many works done in the past years around suicide prevention. And so much effort has been put in, and yet we are still seeing an increase in numbers over the courses of the years. What makes this time different? I do strongly believe that as a province, there is a much more holistic perspective of suicide prevention, and that the province acknowledging that community plays a role is huge, because that means that there's an opportunity there to draw on resources and build capacity. So there are 2 recommendations that come from the Suicide Prevention and Risk Reduction Framework, which was adopted early in 2020. The first is that there's a recommendation that we strengthen and extend community-based supports and services in support of individuals at risk of suicide, particularly in communities that have higher rates of suicide. And the second being expanding efforts to evaluate and provide targeted gatekeeper training as appropriate to community-based organizations and individuals who may regularly come into contact with people at risk of suicide. So to have these two recommendations within that framework is a critical piece in helping create more momentum for communities to do work. And what we need to have a better understanding is, what do community suicide prevention-based supports look like? And it's more than just assist training. Assist training is an important component of it, but it's more than that. And what do we need to do in our day-to-days to help people further upstream and before they're at higher risk? And then I'll be talking more about training opportunities and that sort of thing. And what does that mean when we say that we need more training to do this? And we'll do that. We'll go through throughout the presentation, talk a little bit more about that. Okay, and now I offer kind of just a little bit of understanding around Nova Scotia's mental health system. Some of you may be familiar with this as well, and for some it may be new. And Erin's going to attach a document. She's going to put in the chat there a link to a document called Milestone Our Journey, which was done by Mental Health and Addictions Nova Scotia. And this is to, and that particular document, Milestone Our Journey, really explains this tiered system in much more detail than what I'm going to offer you today. But what I wanted to highlight here again is that tier 2, where it says primary care, self-management, and community care, that's where we fit in with community. And as a mental health system, there's a role that has been identified, that is acknowledged within our mental health system that we play. How we play it, what do we do, how do we do this well? That is what not well known, and that's what we need to build our understandings more. So often when we think of the mental health system, we think of tier 3, 4, 5, and that's when we're going to have the more inpatient and outpatient services, and we think of the traditional mental health care system. But I want to acknowledge that within the system that we also as community play a role with that. And that's just important, again, as we work to advocate for more capacity building, and that there is a role that Nova Scotia Health does, and it's along the side here, it says support. They support community in that role. So we have to understand better what that looks like. So this may be familiar with people as well around the mental health continuum. So there's varying illustrations of what the mental health continuum is, but the underlying principle of it is that we all have mental health, and it works on a continuum. So we go from being healthy and feeling good and being able to cope and do the things that we would like to be doing, and attending work or going to school and taking care of ourselves, to the other end of the spectrum where we're not doing well and we need help and support, and that could look like clinical support in that. And so I asked the question, where do we see community's role in preventing suicide? So when people are on this path and things are not going well, and they continue to experience suicidal ideations, and their ideations grow and become more complex, where do we see? And so I'll just offer you to throw in the chat. Do you think, are we more, should community be intervening at the green, the yellow, the orange, or the red? And so if people can just throw that into the chat, I think, yeah, I can see. And there is no really right answer, right? But just where do you see it, right? Okay. So I would argue that traditionally that we often see community suicide prevention in actually there's more of this red space, right? So there's been many efforts over the years to educate people and train people on programs like Assist, which help us identify when people are in crisis and help navigate them into the mental health system and those clinical supports and that. And that is a very important role for community to play. We do need people in community that can help assess, whether people are in need of clinical supports and how to help them navigate into that system. But I will also suggest that we need to go further back here into the yellow and into the green and say, how can we help people before they get to the point where they're very ill? And completely acknowledging that it's complex, that in some cases, there's only so much that one can do in that, but there are many cases where we're actually able to provide support. It can stop people from becoming very ill, as well as acknowledging that when people do experience inpatient training and they get that treatment, that they are also going to be returning back to our community. And if anybody has ever been through counseling or therapy, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work that you have to do yourself. And if you're trying to do that work while also trying to find a job, while also trying to find affordable housing, while also trying to find a place to belong, that individual work becomes very impossible to do. And we see people getting re-entered back into inpatient care because they don't necessarily have the supports around them to do that work. So here's a quote here. Follow me on social media, right? And because I love memes, right? And my algorithms always give me lots of gems. This is one that came up on my feed one day. So we aim to be the flower, but we tend to forget the plant cannot stand without the root. And so acknowledging the fact that what the environment and the relationships that we have in our lives provide the nourishment that we need to grow and flourish. And that happens in community. It's not going to happen as much in a clinical setting, right? They're going to provide the clinical supports, they're going to provide the treatments, and that's needed at times as well. But without a good, solid foundation, we can't continue to grow and be the people that we're meant to be. So I'm going to go through the next few slides around 5 different ways that the World Health Organization has identified as roles the community plays with suicide prevention. And I'm going to talk about some of the traditional ways that this has happened, and then I'm going to ask people to kind of expand their minds a little bit and understand this in a way that we can be more holistic with our approach and widen what community can do in this space. So the first one is around means restriction, which traditionally was looking at things like gun control and access to prescription medications and this type of thing. So identifying the methods or places where a high number of suicides occur and implementation of measures to ensure safe access to them. So for some communities, this might look like high traffic areas, railroads, bridges, this type of thing. And what can we do to make these spaces safer? So one thing that I've learned in my work with Roots of Hope is one of the early people that kind of came to me when they heard that this work was starting to happen was ground search and rescue. And the stories that they have about trying to find people who are lost in the woods, and they've intentionally lost themselves in the woods, and the number of times that they've been asked to respond to find people who they call them despondents, so people who are lost and who are not looking to be found, is the number of people have increased dramatically over the last few years, and they are looking to increase their abilities to help find people faster. So in Nova Scotia, I don't know what it's like in other provinces, but it's interesting to think in our rural communities how our forests and are a place that are now, where we need to think about safety, right? And so how can we support ground search and rescue in their work in that? So I think Erin's going to drop in the chat there, a link to ground search and rescue. So one of the ways that we need to do is help support ground search and rescue with more equipment. There is equipment that's available, but that they don't have access to, that could help people find people, because people are lost in the dark. There are people who are not wanting to be found. So some of the traditional methods they use to find people are not going to work in this situation. Okay, another area of action is around training and networks. And so the World Health Organization acknowledges that healthcare providers such as physicians, nurse practitioners, as well as community gatekeepers such as first responders, human resource staff, and teachers. So this is where, so for example, assist training would traditionally lie in. So the assist training has been offered for a number of decades now. It's training that's available to help people in the community understand when people are at risk, create safety plans for people, help people navigate into the system. Extremely important work. And then there's also training that's being done with physicians and nurse practitioners to better understand suicide ideations, how to recognize them when people are in for visits and that, because there are a number of people who, before attempting or completing suicide, do go to see family doctors, but family doctors may not always recognize those signs. So all of that is extremely important work and work that needs to continue. And I suggest that we need to expand our ideas of what training looks like for community to encompass more people. Because in my mind, I think, you know, if we were able to train one person for every 500 in a community, it would not be enough, right? Because when people are contemplating suicide, it happens in people's homes, it happens in schools, it's happening in people's workplaces, and you may or may not connect with these people, right? And it's because of the stigma that's attached with suicide. It's not something that people are very open about. So we need to expand our minds around what training looks like and how we can create better social spaces for people to be in, to be able to feel safe. So Erin's going to drop in a link there for the Be There certificate from JAC.org. That's a mental health literacy training. So helping us understand how we can have difficult conversations, challenging conversations, uncomfortable conversations, what that looks like. And another option could be around training for workplace health, psychological health and safety. So sometimes, like it says, because we're trying to prevent the downward spiral, right? So we're not just looking at people in crisis, but looking at, you know, maybe somebody's going through a hard time. They need certain accommodations at work. We need workplaces to better understand what their psychological health and safety looks like and what they can do to be more proactive with it. Are we doing okay for the chat there, Erin? Anything coming up?
Yes, something from Mark at CMHA Halifax Dartmouth. She's agreeing with Bev. Good points, Heather and Danielle and Bev. Bev says, I feel that in our current health system, we wait until individuals are in crisis before we provide support. And Heather agrees, and so does Marilyn, and so does Mark.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you. Thank you, Bev and Mark, and everyone for that. All right, so another area is around public awareness. So public awareness being what are we doing to help bring more awareness around suicide prevention and what people can do, help reduce the stigma around suicide. So locally driven campaigns to promote mental health awareness, posters, brochures, social media, and collaboration with the media. So the work that we're doing or that could be done or should be done with media around reporting on suicides is critical, making sure that it's being reported in a safe way, make sure that it's being reported correctly. And these are all very traditional ways that we've gone about it, as well as public awareness campaigns. So the province will be rolling out a men's campaign shortly. So you're going to be seeing some messaging around suicide prevention and men who are particularly high vulnerable risk population, older men. And those are important initiatives. And what I'm also seeing is more and more people talking about it in social media. More and more people sharing their experiences, more and more people who in obituaries are disclosing and sharing that they've lost this person to suicide. And this, in my mind, is also public awareness. So I'm going to share, and I'm sharing this with permission from Annette, and Annette lost her son, Nick, to suicide not long ago. And so Erin's going to drop in her Facebook page as well as the website for Nick for mental health and Stomp Out Stigma for Nick. And so give her a like, give her a share, show some love to Annette, because this is a person who is using her experience to help bring awareness of what we can do around suicide prevention. And I see this as a key role as we move forward in Nova Scotia, and how we are going to build community capacity is providing people like Annette who have their stories and their experiences that we can learn from and help create situations where others do not have to experience loss like that. Erin's also going to drop in the chat there a link to a video that Jaden Silva had done. And so Debbie, I know you're on the call and I wanted to share it with us live here, but we did a little trial run and for some reason the sound wasn't working for us. So, but I encourage you to look at this video that Jaden did, which so accurately describes their experiences in being a transgender person in Nova Scotia and what that feels like. And again, it's these awarenesses that we need to have of what people's experiences are like here, and how can we help people and create the spaces and relationships to help people feel supported and contribute to the hope that they feel. Okay, and so the last one here is, no, this is the second last one, specialized supports. There's sort of 4 areas here: the prevention, crisis, post-crisis services, so peer support. So Kyle, I see you here, and Kyle's with Peer Support Nova Scotia. Such an important work you guys are doing, and I just read about the new expansion that's going to be happening with peer support. It's so amazing, and I hear that often from people that I talk with who have lost to suicide. Or who have contemplated in the past, or supporting people who are contemplating. Peer support, huge, because when you don't have to share that experience of what it's like, and people kind of have like some common understanding. Then there's support groups, including self-help groups. So there's like self-help connections, which is in Nova Scotia as well. The work that they do is amazing in helping people understand what they need to do to take care of themselves and achieve the goals. And it's all about providing hope for people. Workplace interventions. So I mentioned about the psychological health and safety of workplaces. So it's more, I feel it's more than teaching your HR people what to do. So, and Karen, I know you have a background in HR as well. And I mean, the HR people are leaned on heavy when it comes to those relationships at work. And that is important work, and HR people should have a good understanding of it. But we need managers and supervisors and everybody in the workplace supportive of people's mental health and what that means. And it's tough, right? So when we have someone who's down and out, that means we're picking up, and supporting each other through that. So it's more than just interventions when someone's in crisis. It's more than when we've lost someone in our workplace, what we're going to do afterwards to help support the people through the grief. We need to back that train up and help people understand, how do we support people's mental health? And then this last one here, coordinated planning and access to services. So that's leaning more on our bridge into the healthcare system. So here we sit in tier 2 with community. There is a bridge there to tier 3s to tier 5s. There's a bridge back when people are done their inpatient care. That needs to be worked through, right? And we need to have that better understanding of what we need to do to support people throughout the tiers, right? And navigate through that. Okay, and then this last one here. So the World Health Organization also recognizes that research is a priority, and surveillance and monitoring, evaluation of implementation activities is critical. And I will tell you, the research on suicide, community suicide interventions is dismal. Not because it's not working, it's just really badly evaluated. We really just don't know the impact that we're having. And so it's really, really important as we move forward with our work with research, with community suicide prevention, that we understand what's happening and the impact we're making, and that we're documenting this so that it gets more momentum behind it, right? Because a lot of the research right now is sitting in that clinical space, which is very important. And we know it's not the only answer. We need to have a much more holistic approach to it. The other piece of research is that it's largely quantitative or numbers based. And so, huge sample sizes, surveying many, many people and that. And, that gives us a certain amount of information, but because suicide is so complex and so individual, we need to have a better understanding of people's lived experience. So I'm very keen on building research agendas that take more of a qualitative approach, look at more of the storytelling of what people's experiences are, and understanding those experiences. And just sometimes the myth around qualitative research is that it's not transferable to larger populations, but it is. There's so much that we can learn, and that we'll never get from a survey or from numbers. We need to hear from people, from what is going on. Okay, anything else there in the chat that's coming up, Erin? Questions or anything that anyone's debating? You don't have to agree with me by any stretch.
So there's quite a few comments, not in terms of debate, just lots of sharing. So Bev from the CMHA Halifax Dartmouth branch says, oftentimes people who are at risk of suicide or contemplating present themselves very differently on the outside, and it doesn't match what they're feeling or experiencing within. Mm-hmm. Stephanie, I will butcher your last name. I apologize. So Stephanie says, Stephanie also has a Facebook group, and she's put the link here. Where she shares her personal journey with mental health and mental illness to raise awareness if everyone is interested. And she's got the link there. So I urge you to take a look. And Heather is responding to Bev. Heather lost her nephew to suicide in December. And she says he was 36, and further to Bev's comment, appeared happy, and that his doctor was struggling, and his doctor just kept prescribing medication that made him feel worse. 2 months after he passed, his wife received a call from a psychiatrist's office with an appointment for him. She says there are so many stories like this in Nova Scotia.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Yeah, and this isn't to place blame in any particular direction. It's to acknowledge that we all have space to do our parts in it, and last night